connected? No. Is it working? Hello, everyone. Debbie, Ms. Cutler, Mr. Wolff, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, great.
So I'm here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us today. I'm Dukgeun, professor at the Seoul National University in Korea. I'm very honored to moderate today's webinar arranged by the KITA. I'm very grateful for really renowned experts from all over the world to join this particular event. Particularly the Ms. Cutler, very early in the morning in DC. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we can begin our webinar now. So today's topic, the new global trade and the business environment in post-COVID-19 era, is actually the most the important issue at the current stage of the global economy. I believe that today's discussion by our experts will shed important light on the future efforts by the WTO member countries and the global economy constituents. Let me explain first for two excuse from our participants. The Minister Mary Ng, Minister of Small Business Export Promotion and International Trade from Canada, couldn't make it. So she replaced her presence with recorded presentation. And the Professor Mary Loverly at the PIIE, she also had some technical problem in her hometown. So she couldn't make it today. So we will have just one discussant instead of two. But other than that, I believe still we have a lot of participants today, and we will have very important discussion. Okay, to begin with, I suggest our participants today briefly introduce themselves. So let me start by myself. I'm Professor An at the Seoul National University. I'm currently working as a Dean of International Affairs of our university. I'm teaching trade law, trade policy, basically trade negotiation.
Hi, I'm Myung-hee, Korea's Trade Minister, and it's very good to see you all.
The Ms. Wolff, Mr. Wolff, Alan?
Yes, I'm Alan Wolff, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and good to be with you.
Was that Debbie or Wendy? It could have been either one of us. I'll go next. Sorry. Debbie Elms, Asian Trade Center in Singapore, and delighted to be here with such great presenters and great audience. Thanks.
We cannot hear you. Can you turn on the mic?
Wendy Cutler, Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, former USTR negotiator. Great to see everyone, and particularly Minister Yu. Good morning from me.
Great, thank you very much. So without further ado, let me start with our Trade Minister Yu with opening remarks.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. I don't know which camera I should look to look better on the screen. And first of all, let me begin by extending my warm welcome to all of you and my thanks to the organizer of this webinar. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the new global trade and business environment in post-COVID-19 era, especially with the renowned trade experts from around the world. As we are currently experiencing, the world today is facing a once-in-a-century public health crisis. Experts say the scope and speed of today's economic fallout are without modern precedent. More than anything, this crisis has forced the next normal onto us, compelling us to reflect upon the cherished values that we once take for granted. First of all, the World Trade Order, as defined by globalization and multilateralism, is headed towards a once-in-a-generation shift. The threats from the coronavirus has supercharged economic nationalism and also has led to pandemic protectionism, as evidenced by a myriad of trade restrictions imposed in the wake of the pandemic. Second, the global value chain is set to undergo major restructuring. The pandemic has exposed to us the vulnerabilities of our supply chains, thereby shifting the emphasis away from efficiency to resilience. What is more concerning is that major economies now overtly pursue strategic autonomy, especially in their critical industries. Finally, COVID-19 will further accelerate the pace of the ongoing digitalization. Actually, in fact, our webinar today is a telling proof of that trend. With the rapid expansion of e-commerce activities and also psychological barriers to online services lower than before, we have now very fertile ground for the digital economy to grow and thrive. However, norms on digital trade still remain largely bifurcated or even trifurcated, and the differences in technology level between countries continue to deepen the digital divide. Well, now let me touch upon what actions we should take in terms of trade. First and foremost, in response to this pandemic, the Korean government has tried its best to ensure continued operation of business activities by reconnecting trade links and business people flows that have been temporarily severed by COVID-19 around the world. As many countries right now gradually open for business away from this great lockdown, such a reconnection is a critical element to restore stability and predictability for the business community. In this vein, Korea adopted a joint ministerial statement on action plans to facilitate the flow of goods and services, as well as essential movement of people, together with the like-minded countries. And we hope to see more countries participate in this initiative. But we also need to look beyond this imminent crisis. With the lessons learned from this pandemic, and also in tandem with the changing trade environment, we should strive for a responsive, relevant, and resilient multilateral trading system going forward. Basically, 3 R's for the future direction of the multilateral trading system. First, in regard to responsive trading system, we need to create a global trade order that enables responsive actions to global crises such as the ongoing pandemic, especially with a view to ensuring essential flows of goods and people, even in times of most difficulties. It is encouraging to see recent multilateral commitment of efforts towards this goal by G20 and also WTO. However, we should strive further to develop such commitments into a global trade and investment guideline or protocol that can be used in future crises or future contingencies, something akin to contingency plan adopted by business organizations around the world. Second, we also need to strive for a relevant multilateral system which can light the pathway and also help countries adapt to the changing trade environments in the post-pandemic world. In this context, we need to restore the negotiating function of the WTO and update its rulebook to befit today's transforming trade order. In particular, a top priority should be given to e-commerce negotiations, especially given the rising importance after this outbreak. Last but not least, we should strengthen the multilateral trade system to enhance the resilience so that it can help establish a sustainable global trade order and also secure the stability of global supply chains. In particular, we should reinforce our multilateral cooperation to close cross-country, cross-company gaps that might widen in the process of global supply restructuring and also digital transition to ultimately make sure that no one is left behind. Throughout this process, the middle-sized countries as soft powers in the world of trade are likely to become even more important. Korea will maintain its open economy principles and pursue collective leadership and cooperation, especially among the middle-sized, like-minded countries, to hasten global recovery and shape together a better post-pandemic world trade order. There are important lessons to be learned from the history. Widespread protectionism hindered global economic recovery after the Great Depression. International cooperation and concerted efforts for establishing a global trade order served as key instruments that led to the splendid economic growth out of the ruins of the Second World War. So it may be a little far-fetched to call this pandemic a make or break point for the globalization as we know it, but I hope that we can all work together to reposition this pandemic as a blessing in disguise towards perhaps globalization chapter 2. So in that regard, I very much look forward to meaningful discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister Yu. The Minister Ng, as I mentioned, couldn't join today, so we will move to her recorded presentation.
Hello, everyone. 안녕하세요. I'm sorry I could not join you on this webinar, but I'm happy that technology allows me to share a few words with all of you today. I want to thank Kim Jong-yu and the entire Korean International Trade Association team for bringing your hard work in helping businesses navigate through this challenging time. And I want to especially thank Minister Yu for inviting me to speak today. We know that this is a challenging time for people around the world, and that citizens and business owners are worried about what comes next. Canada believes that supporting our citizens economically at the same time as protecting their health is the best way to help them through this extraordinary time. We have taken unprecedented action to give our businesses and all Canadians direct support to help them weather this storm. We also know that open and stable supply chains are crucial to helping our businesses and our workers at this uncertain time, especially when many around the world are bringing in barriers to trade. That's why we're working closely with our international partners, especially Korea, to keep trade and supply chains open so that workers and businesses in Canada and around the world have the stability that they need, and so that people can continue to access the essential goods and services during this critical time. It was fantastic for our two countries to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement at a special event in Ottawa this past February, which seems like a lifetime ago. Over the last 5 years since our FTA was brought into force, the relationship between our two countries has deepened and two-way trade has increased by 31%. Today, Korea is Canada's 6th largest import and export partner. 95% of Canada's exports to Korea and almost 100% of Canada's imports from Korea are eligible for duty-free entry. As we continue to see incredible growth and new opportunities for people in both countries in sectors such as technology, energy, and manufacturing, to name a few, and there are more. Another key example of our country's collaboration was the May 1st joint statement action plan, focused on opening supply chains, simplify logistics and business travel, and strengthen the multilateral trading system. I was eager to endorse this joint effort on behalf of Canada, which was initiated by Minister Yu in partnership with Singapore, New Zealand, and Australia. On May the 5th, Canada and 20 members of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation endorsed a statement committing to mitigating the economic actions impacts on our citizens caused by COVID-19 and to plan for economic recovery, especially in developing countries. Through this statement, we agreed to help businesses harness the opportunities available in the digital economy to enable seamless international business and cross-border trade as we navigate a new normal that means more physical distancing. During our virtual meeting earlier this month, Minister Yu and I discussed the importance of everyone accessing the benefits of trade, including women entrepreneurs, as a shared priority for our two countries. From working with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada on the organization's first women-only business mission to Korea, to investing in Canada's Business Women in International Trade program, we know that helping women entrepreneurs access the customers and opportunities available in the Korean market is key to our economic success as a country. Canada believes that a reliable, rules-based international trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core is crucial for businesses of every size in every sector across every region. The WTO has a critical role to play, both in supporting our crisis response to COVID-19 and in laying the foundation for a sustainable economic recovery. In the weeks ahead, Canada, Korea, and our fellow members of the Ottawa Group will continue to build on the work that we've done to strengthen and modernize the WTO, while also examining how we can improve international trade rules for our citizens in the event of future crisis. And even through the changes and challenges that COVID-19 has brought, Canada and Korea share a special relationship, and we are committed to strengthening our ties. I look forward to our continued close collaboration in trade and innovation. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Okay, as our ministers mentioned, we are indeed at the critical stage for reshaping the global trade landscape. So for this matter, I cannot think of the better person than Mr. Wolff to share the insight on this matter. So please, Mr. Wolff, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today, virtually. I thank Korea's International Trade Association, KITA, for hosting this event, and much benefited from and enjoyed the statements of Minister Yu and Minister Ng. The pandemic is an unprecedented challenge, it's been said, in our time, not just to world health, but also to the world economy. National governments, pressed for a response, enacted both trade restrictions and import liberalizing measures with respect to medical supplies. They acted individually in the first place. Fortunately, in terms of numbers, the liberalizing trade measures have exceeded those of trade restrictions. The WTO Secretariat has collected notifications from members of their measures and published that information on the WTO website, a special web page for COVID-19 measures. This provides essential transparency for planning both by national policy makers and for businesses. The WTO has also alerted members to the effects of the pandemic and responses to it by issuing its trade forecast, which you're probably familiar with. The direct effects of the pandemic, depressing both supply and demand, as well as to a much lesser extent the effects of trade measures, has a projected effect of lowering the amount of world trade in 2020 by by 13 to 32%, depending upon the degree to which companies can reopen and trade can be restarted. They're looking forward to 2021 being a time of recovery, but we have to watch the progression of the virus as well as the economic effects of measures taken to fight the virus. Keeping trade open in the face of the pandemic has been the subject of initiatives which have been cited in part. Ottawa Group, of course, Singapore, New Zealand, Canada, Korea, Switzerland. These initiatives have been circulated to the 164 members of the WTO for them to consider signing on. And some have done so and are continuing to consider doing so. The evolving shape of world trade, including global supply chains, will be shaped primarily by how businesses view future economic actions. There will be some limited onshoring to the extent that government policies will be available to support a reflow from an era of globalization. But government budgets have already been strained by fiscal measures to fight the pandemic. The availability of funds to support onshoring is likely to be limited and targeted, presumably mostly to certain medical supplies. And even there, government stockpiles could be an alternative to onshoring. It may be preferred to direct industrial support. The products affected and the duration of the support may be limited. Onshoring is likely also to be affected by tax measures. Governments need to raise revenues, and in most countries in the world, increases in taxation may affect the ability to bring back businesses for onshoring. So the likelihood of a lot of onshoring may be limited. Supply chains will also be affected by some likely diversification among foreign suppliers. But again, this will be determined by economics, by the viability of changing supply chains. Businesses can plan for contingencies, but in the end, they have to have revenues and they have to have profits. So economics is going to determine what happens with supply chains. The leanest of just-in-time supply chains may be a level of efficiency that can no longer be afforded because supply chains have been disrupted and businesses will probably have to plan to have greater inventories than they have in the past. But that, again, is constrained by economics. There's a limit to the amount of inventory that can be carried. So outside of supporting the production and stockpiling of medical supplies and vaccines, what's going to govern the future? Technology and market forces. There'll be greater factors determining trading patterns than most government policies, including regional trade agreements. In an extreme emergency, even membership in a customs union did not prevent some individual national actions which were contrary to the ideal of a single market. Regional trading arrangements can be useful for exploring paths forward, for making experiments in rulemaking where progress can be more advanced than more easily achieved than on a global basis among 164 countries. And regional integration is a worthy goal and should be supported. Nevertheless, in terms of total trade flows, sub-multilateral agreements are not determining most of world trade. Businesses still have to serve markets wherever they're located and will continue to need to reach out beyond the regions in which they are located. As an official of the WTO, my primary concern is how well prepared the multilateral trading system is for the challenges it now faces and that it will face. For the World Trade Organization, I see three areas of challenge. First, dealing with the trade aspects of the pandemic. Second, discerning trade measures that can aid in the economic recovery. And third, planning economic reforms, systemic reforms. So part one, responding to the Corona-19 pandemic. Epidemiologists predict that there will likely be a series of second waves of coronavirus. We have seen some outbreaks in some countries already, which are being managed by Korea, among others, and Singapore, but they will happen elsewhere. There is the potential for additional national restrictions being placed on the availability of vaccines when they're available, and pharmaceutical remedies when they are available, or use outside of the country of their invention and or production. So the values of the multilateral trading system will be needed now more than ever in order to minimize disruptions of the necessary means to meet upcoming health and economic challenges. Collective actions are now essential. Suggestions have been made, including from WTO members, to what could be done. One is build on the various initiatives led by Canada, Singapore, Korea, New Zealand, and Switzerland to give coherent direction for the crafting of national trade policies. Secondly, agreeing, as in the WTO agreement on agriculture, to have countries consider the effect on others of applying export restrictions, to give them prior notice before restrictions are put into place, to engage in timely consultations. Third, considering excluding in any restrictions a sunset clause. This is a temporary emergency. So emergency measures should go away with the emergency when it goes away, and providing for a rollback of current trade restrictions which don't have a sunset clause and are no longer needed. Giving multilaterally agreed guidance for the sharing of scarce medical supplies, including vaccines. We can see that that problem may well occur, and we can plan for it. Considering putting into place a members' emergency task force at the WTO or some other mechanism like that to flesh out options for consideration by members. Part 2 would involve planning for assisting with the recovery. This will mainly be something that finance ministers will focus on, but trade ministers can play a part. Trade liberalization, trade liberalizing measures can aid in the recovery, can include tariff reductions, can include other means to facilitate trade, including implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement to a greater extent, which will take assistance to a number of less developed, least developed countries. In addition, the WTO Secretariat could engage in heightened coordination with international financial institutions and private sector actors to restore trade finance. The fact is, trade finance had not recovered from the 2008-2009 financial crisis. That means that, particularly in developing countries and the least developed, the financing available for trade dried up and has not been restored. So that needs attention. The third part is systemic reform. In the current upsurge in criticism of the inadequacies of collective responses to the pandemic, the WTO is receiving heightened scrutiny. If the WTO members are to meet the challenges of the coronavirus and the desperately needed economic recovery, frankly, most of the public criticism of the WTO will go away. But the problems that preceded the pandemic will, absent reforms, persist after the pandemic is over and its after effects have been addressed. There were problems that G20 said before the pandemic, so there are longer term issues that have to be addressed. It's necessary to understand what the values are of the multilateral trading system, what it's designed to promote, before it can be reformed. A serious inquiry into this subject would serve three purposes. First, know the value of what we actually have, which the public is not very well aware of at this point. Two, determine if the values of the current system enjoy the support of all WTO members. And third, address the degree to which the WTO is of sufficient continuing relevance as it is currently constituted, or whether it needs fundamental change. In a longer version of these remarks, which I've given to Kita and they can circulate, and it will be on the WTO website, it contains an enumeration of what I see as the current values of the current system of the WTO. And I would say that one of the suggestions that I would make is that the multilateral trading system needs a policy planning capability drawing on dedicated talent, not just within the WTO members and the Secretariat in Geneva, but from capitals. We need forward planning. In the United States, several of our departments have a policy planning division. We do not have that at the WTO. We do not have that, as far as I know, for the multilateral trading system within member governments. So we need somebody who is not tasked with daily responsibilities to think about the future. It's where I think probably the work on e-commerce came from capitals. It's where we got a services negotiation some years ago to think about what the needs of the system are going forward. Well, my list of the underlying values are to have 16 that I've identified. Others will have other thoughts on the subject. The first two, which are not obvious to all of us today, are supporting peace and stability. This was a key concern of the founders of the multilateral trading system in 1948. And it is brought back to us by many of the countries that are acceding to the WTO today, who are conflict affected. So Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Timor-Leste, Iraq, a number of these countries they understand the need for open trade to lift the standard of living of their peoples and give greater stability and a better chance at peace. That is a major concern now of quite a number of countries coming into the WTO and the most recent acceding countries to the WTO, which were Afghanistan and Liberia. Other values are more prominent and easily identified: non-discrimination, transparency, reciprocity, international cooperation, and the rule of law. They're all more obvious. Still others are more nuanced, less obvious perhaps, and emerge only upon reflection. They well-being. In the Havana Charter that would have set up the International Trade Organization, well-being is one of the things that's cited. In the Marrakesh Accord, which set up the WTO, they talk about full employment as an objective. So well-being is one such quality. Equality, equal treatment of all countries. Every country in the WTO has an equal voice. Every member has an equal voice. Every member has an equal call on the Secretariat for services. Every member can veto anything that is taking place or put a proposal on the table. So equality, sovereignty. Sovereign countries are left sovereign. The WTO does not compel any country to do anything. There may be a cost for not complying with an obligation, that's true, but the fact is sovereignty is preserved. Universality. The WTO is open to all, and in fact, all should join it. The whole idea of a multilateral trading system is that every country will be in it. Development. The notion is that all countries should rise to the level of being able to take full advantage of all of the benefits of the organization and be able to undertake all of the obligations eventually. That's the hope. Market forces to determine competitive outcomes, not government intervention, is essential. Convergence, that the WTO is not about coexistence. It's about every country aspiring to a state of open trade where market forces determine competitive outcomes. And there is an element of morality. We would not have a provision in the WTO for the sharing of medical technology under compulsory licensing if there were, in emergencies, if there were not a sense of there's a moral commitment for dealing with trade. And the last addition, which is more recent, is sustainability. The sustainability development goals of the United Nations, all of the members of the WTO have subscribed to them. And with our fishery subsidies negotiation, that's one aspect that we are currently addressing. And I'm sure members have ideas for the future of other things like circular economy like plastic pollution in the oceans, that they want to bring into the WTO. So a serious discussion of WTO reform is long overdue. The pandemic simply adds to the urgency of it taking place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. There's a lot of interesting issue tossed up for our discussion. And then Debbie will address the issue from the this part of the world perspective.
Great, thank you very much. I was reminded as we were talking that Alan Wolff and I were together at an event and I was looking up when it was in September, and I made the argument back in September that we were on the Titanic, that we had hit the iceberg, and that we were going down. This was a contentious argument even in September, but my argument at the time was that we had various stresses in the global system. We had an ongoing and apparently never-ending US-China trade war. We had a lack of leadership in general and a lack of enthusiasm for various parts of the trade agenda. We have had difficulties not just in the WTO setting, but in other settings as well. As many of our Korean colleagues will know, we did not have an APEC final meeting. Not because of APEC itself, but because of one of the APEC economies. The host at the time couldn't hold the meeting. All of these things were sort of emblematic, in my view, of the Titanic hitting the iceberg. Now, many people, of course, disagreed with me at the time. I stand by my point. We had hit the iceberg. And then on top, as if it wasn't bad enough, we hit COVID. Well, I don't even know what that is in my analogy, right? So we've already hit an iceberg, we're sinking, and now on top of that, I don't know, there's no island nearby, I don't know, rescue boats are not in the water, I don't know what the analogy would be, but not good. And so in this situation where we had an unsettled picture to begin with, institutions that weren't functioning, leadership that is non-existent, a lack of commitment to the overall system, we have a global pandemic, so it's hitting supply, it's hitting demand, and it's hitting globally. There's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide. This is really now my new analogy, perfect storm. So perfect storm hits, and here we are trying to figure out what to do in response. And I think this gets very tricky. You can make an argument, of course, that you should seize a crisis and, turn every crisis into an opportunity. I think that'd be awesome. I think it'd be fantastic if the WTO could seize the initiative and actually turn itself into the organization that everyone aspires to have, that leaders could say, this is the institution that I really want to support. That businesses would come back to the WTO table and say, this matters to us, and here's why it matters to us. That countries would come forward and groups would come forward and say, for development reasons, we really want the WTO and the multilateral system to work as intended, so that you could have this sort of, unifying moment around creating the global rules of the game and then structuring within that matches better today's environment. So today's environment, which is many things, it includes more people in more places, it's digital, it's online, it's fast, it's allows the sharp distinctions between developed and developing have eroded. There is a larger focus on, sort of collective solutions to problems. And all of those, that would be great, right? Wouldn't it be fantastic if we could create that kind of environment? And as an added bonus, I would argue for my let's seize an opportunity moment, the WTO leadership itself is actually stepping out. So we have the Director General stepping down, the head of the Agricultural Committee just announced that he's leaving. So we have an opportunity for leadership at the institutional level to help realize a new vision. So wouldn't that be fantastic if we took this moment, first of all, bad to begin with, but now we have some focus on trade, an opportunity to line up some new folks in leadership posts to really finally do some of the things that people have been talking about forever, or what feels like forever to me, and make it happen. My challenge is that as much as an enthusiast as I might be for global trade and the multilateral system, I remain unconvinced that we are going to be able to overcome all of these challenges while everyone is now underneath the storm. And so while I think it would be fantastic, obviously I support this effort, I think it's going to be real challenging. So then my what do we do instead? Because we can't exactly throw our hands up and say, we're all doomed, we're all going to drown tomorrow, and what can you do? Woe is me. This is not adequate either. So what we've been suggesting, or what I've been suggesting, I think makes sense, is a couple of things. So if you're not going to get the global system to function as it can, then can you at least get better integration and better commitments regionally? Let's just start with regionally. I mean, it's great to have the coalitions of the willing. I'm very enthusiastic about coalitions of the willing. Coalitions of the willing are not as helpful in some regards as a regional agreement, because a regional agreement, in order for it to stick, requires people who are both enthusiastic and people who are not enthusiastic to come together around some common objective. So that's why I'm more enthusiastic about regional agreements than plurilaterals. Plurilaterals tend to be easier because you're bringing in the convert and you're asking them to do something they already presumably had some intention of doing anyways. So the regional agreements to me are helpful. They're helpful for a couple of reasons. One, they're helpful for businesses. So we've mentioned a couple times already about supply chain restructuring. That is going to happen. It is not happening like members of the media expect, which is that you just like wake up one morning and say, I'm going to move my factory tomorrow. It's much more complicated, more expensive, and more difficult than people imagine. And not all of them are even mobile. And even if they were, where would you go? So it's very difficult. But we are starting to get a lot more companies coming to us to say, we are actually now at least thinking about restructuring. What do we need to do and how do we need to do that? And one piece of advice that we've been giving that is becoming very powerful for firms is start looking at how you can use trade agreements to your benefit. Because depressingly, for someone who's been doing trade agreements for a long time, teaching and training and so forth, firms don't use them. And they don't use them for a couple of reasons. One is that the older generation of FTAs, trade agreements in particular, were lousy. Even some of the new ones are really quite wretched in terms of what the things that businesses actually need. So we open up areas that we're not interested in, and we close off areas that actually matter to business. That seems to be a common problem. I just spent a very painful 2 weeks going through EU Singapore, just to give an example. Thankfully, there's no Europeans or Singaporeans on this call, but I will tell you that wretched. I mean, from a business perspective, so difficult to use, so hard to explain to a company how or what the benefits will be. My example from this is biscuits. If you want to sell a biscuit from Singapore to the European Union, you have to figure out literally the weight of the flour, the weight of the dairy content, add in extra tariff levels for all of those, remanufacture it, and then you might, if you're lucky, be able to get into the European Union under a certain tariff rate quota in order to sell your biscuits. I mean, why would a business do this? Unless you are really convinced that your biscuit is something, no one will do so. So this is a challenge. We've had some bad agreements. We have some fantastic agreements. And of course, I have to hats off to Wendy in particular for CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is great. That's much easier to use. You can sell biscuits, yay. So there are better agreements. And so firms are starting to use those and think about how to use them. The other thing that I'm going to say about regional agreements, and I know this is going to be controversial again, but I'm saying it anyways, is we have an interesting opportunity in Asia, I think, as a result of ongoing trade negotiations under RCEP. So the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, of which Korea is a part, has been going on for what feels like eternity, but is now almost finished, should be signed in November. Now, RCEP was not designed, I will be clear, it was not designed from the beginning to somehow really support the WTO, as in if the WTO is not functioning, then RCEP could function in some, not identical, but parallel or some supportive way. Obviously, they're not in conflict with one another, but they weren't designed. RCEP was not designed as an institutional structure on its own. My argument that I will make, especially before an audience with a trade minister in particular, is I think you have the makings of an interesting platform for trade going forward, because in RCEP, you have 15+1, that's all 10 ASEAN members, Korea, Japan, China, India, Australia, New Zealand. The Indians are really not going to be with you, but we'll keep pretending until November that they will be there at the final stage. So you have 15 countries plus a half a country, we'll call India a half member at the moment, 15 countries in Asia who could seize this opportunity to use this as a platform at the minimum for the kinds of conversations that need to happen to rebuild global trade. So you have to start somewhere. Where do you start? You can start with coalitions of the willing. You can start with a platform like an RCEP that brings together diverse countries, where you can start to build consensus around future pathways, future trajectories. And so, although again, RCEP was not made this way from the beginning, I think as we have hit the Titanic on the iceberg going down, you're going to be looking for lifeboats to come seize you. And one of those lifeboats is RCEP. So I think even though it wasn't intended that way, it will become a very important platform. But that, of course, requires, again, while I have a minister listening, you must sign the agreement in November, first of all, whether you have a meeting or you don't have a meeting, and you must do so with or without India. So, you know, you must have an RCEP in order for it to be a lifeboat for you, because otherwise you don't have a boat of that kind either. So I think it's we're in an interesting time here where the vision that most of us have, which is, you know, a functioning, fantastic multilateral system, is not working. The alternatives are not ideal, but some strike me as better than others. And this approach of regionalism, especially here in Asia and elsewhere, but I happen to know Asia better, I think is really worth pursuing and worth paying attention to, because you're not going to rebuild the global trade system until you have consensus in smaller groups. And one of them that obviously matters a lot is Asia. So I expect going forward that RCEP will become an important platform, at the minimum, for conversations that aren't happening elsewhere. So let me just stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I believe Vice President Cutler has also important insight to share with us. Please.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with Kita and such a distinguished group of speakers. I'm not exactly sure what I can add. It seems like we've touched upon everything, but I will try, and I'm going to try and add the U.S. perspective as well. But just taking a step back as the U.S. negotiator for Chorus over 10 years ago now, I really want to extend congratulations to Minister Yu and her team for taking the initiative in Geneva and putting forward kind of a, you know, really bold type of proposal arguing for open trade in goods, services, and movement of persons during the pandemic. I mean, when we think about Chorus, we think about bilateral benefits, but frankly, Chorus was also about bringing Korea to the world economic stage and really elevating Korea's presence in Geneva. So I'm really heartened to see that that's happening, and Korea is taking the lead and showing initiative, particularly at a time, and I'm sad to say this, when the United States is retreating. As many of the speakers mentioned, even before the pandemic, trade was in serious trouble. By the end of the year, we had seen the dispute settlement functions of the WTO become virtually paralyzed, the negotiating agenda stalemated, and not a lot of optimism about how US concerns with respect to China could be addressed in a multilateral setting. And so if things weren't difficult enough, the pandemic came upon us. And not only did it present health issues, but it also now presents some serious economic issues as we move into a global recession. But as one of the previous speakers said, you have to look at every crisis as also an opportunity. And for my remarks, I do want to touch upon 4 issues. The latter 2 vis-a-vis China, but the first 2 with respect to the WTO. First, I think in the WTO, there is an opportunity for an initiative to level the playing field on trade in medical supplies, equipment, and medicines. Alan Wolff had touched upon this, and I think he really raised some good points. In my mind, I'm not calling it a 0 for 0 like the old days or a tariff cutting initiative, but I think if it's called a level playing field initiative, I think that could make it more relevant and I think more attractive to many countries, including the United States, who view the pandemic as a testament to our over-reliance on certain trading partners for essential goods, particularly China. About a week ago, I interviewed China's WTO ambassador, Minister Zhang, and even he said that he understood why countries wanted to manufacture their own medical goods, given what we've all seen in this pandemic. So I think in any initiative, we need to recognize that there are going to be incentives for domestic production of these types of goods to prepare for the next pandemic, to prepare for the next emergency, and to learn our lessons from how unprepared we were this time around. In such an initiative, then, I see that the issues of supply chains needs to be smartly addressed. Export restrictions need to be addressed. I think Alan really put his, he really identified one of the key problems here, and that is Article 11 of the GATT allows for export restrictions, and it's very vague on how and when they should be lifted. The G20 and the WTO and other organizations have talked about these restrictions being temporary, transparent, targeted, and proportionate. But what Alan, I think, was suggesting is we should go further than that. For example, what does temporary mean? Should there be a sunset clause? With respect to transparency, should we be asking for advance notification? So I think these concepts could be fleshed out in such an initiative. It should also include tariff liberalization. And as Alan mentioned, as many of the studies show now, there is a movement among many countries around the world now to either temporarily suspend their tariffs in the medical sector or to really just get rid of them or reduce them. So I think there is some momentum. And there's also non-tariff measures, frankly, that we need to get our hands around as well. Second, and here I just want to echo something that Minister Yu pointed to, I think the time is right for some kind of digital agreement, either a plurilateral in Geneva or a plurilateral outside of Geneva. But the digital trade issue was so important even before the pandemic. But wow, are we all now so reliant on digital technology for shopping, for education, for our work, our conferences, and even trade negotiating. So I would hope that the pandemic, one of the opportunities will be a new urgency given to these negotiations in Geneva, recognizing that there are some serious challenges and difference of views between certain countries that are going to make this a very difficult negotiation to pull off. With respect now to China, I wanted to just mention kind of a WTO related issue, but then also just offer you some insights into where we are bilaterally with China. Before the pandemic, the US, the EU, and Japan were working very hard in trilateral work to come to a consensus on unfair trade practices of state-led economies that should be and need to be addressed in the WTO. And here I'll just underscore one of the 3 R's of Minister Yu, and that is relevancy. If the WTO is going to remain relevant and people in the United States are going to support the WTO, it is critical that many of the state-led practices that China is pursuing, which are partially addressed by the WTO, they need to be addressed. And industrial subsidies is high on the agenda. And this was an area where the 3 parties, the EU, Japan, and the United States, made remarkable headway in coming up with a list of new prohibited subsidies, as well as other subsidies where the burden of proof should shift to the country with the subsidies. This work, unfortunately, is not gaining traction yet, but I'm hopeful that other countries, including Korea, will take a very serious look at this work and hopefully find ways to support it. But what I'm worried about now is, and Alan touched on this earlier, is that with the pandemic, we're seeing more state intervention in economies all around the world. Some of this part of stimulus packages, others is just a corresponding measures that are being pursued to allow countries to deal with some serious and emergency-like economic problems. And so I'm worried what's going on in the state intervention could complicate the work of trying to discipline long-term Chinese industrial subsidies. And I would hope that parties could make a distinction between the types of measures that are being taken now, which hopefully are temporary, but also being conducted on an emergency basis, versus kind of the long-standing subsidy practices of China, which have a very different purpose. And now finally, moving to just the US-China dispute. And here I'm going to try and just focus more on the trade dispute. But in short, relations between the US and China are bad and they're getting worse. And I don't see them improving. In fact, I think they're going to continue to deteriorate between now through November, and then we'll have to see what happens after November. And it's interesting because in this context, in an ironic way, the US-China Phase 1 deal seems to be one of the few remaining kind of bright spots in the relationship. And frankly, it's not as bright as many think. China is doing, in my view, really yeoman's work in implementing the rules part of the US-China trade agreement. They have, gone forward with their commitments and with respect to agriculture non-tariff measures, intellectual property protection, currency, forced technology transfer, in a way that demonstrates that they're serious about implementing the deal. And I think it's very interesting to see that Ambassador Lighthizer seems to be very, let's just say positive about the agreement. But the big exception is the purchasing commitments in that agreement. They were a long shot before COVID and frankly, with COVID now and what's going on with respect to supply and demand, it is impossible to see how these targets are going to be met. And then the question is how the president then views the deal, because our president is very focused on the purchasing targets. And in the past few weeks, frankly, he has talked about withdrawing from that agreement, reconsidering that agreement, imposing more tariffs, even as Ambassador Lighthizer has been praising China with respect to their implementation of the deal. So things are very unclear on this front, and we'll have to see how this plays out in the lead up to the election. But I think in the overall kind of deteriorating atmosphere and deteriorating relationship between the US and China, I think the Phase 1 deal may also become a casualty of these discussions. So I don't mean to conclude on a very pessimistic note here. So let me just conclude and say, again, I think there are things that the WTO can do and its members and that member countries can do outside of the WTO, whether through RCEP or through CPTPP accession or through other regional initiatives. And I would underscore the 3 R's that Minister Yu mentioned as relevant. I think if you ask the Trump administration, they might add one more R, and that would be reciprocity. But I'll leave that for others. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well, history tells us that the current stage of the history will produce a really meaningful change in the global trading system. As you are well aware, in the 1970s, right after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, we had a talk-around negotiation. And then GATT system has been substantially reformed at that time. And then during the 1980s, we had a huge conflict between US versus Japan. And then we had Uruguay round of negotiation, and then we completely changed the shape of the world trading system with the advent of the WTO. Now, with a huge battle or war even between US versus China and the addition of the pandemic, we will see the reshaping of the trade landscape, as Mr. Wolff mentioned. How and when we will complete this mission will become a very important agenda. Also, let me follow up Wendy's comment. The medical trade issue actually is very intriguing issue as a trade scholar. Whenever we talked about this medical issue, normally we exempted this whole area as kind of the general exception area. But now we witness the reality of the no rules, the situations. Every country suffers from the collapse of the international cooperation. So in the medical trade area, basically we are talking about the pharmaceutical products and then the medical device, which is an area of the tariff, but also we talk about the medical services and then investment of the hospitals, and then distant cure. Basically, we are talking about the digital trade issues. So basically, it embraces the whole realm of the current world trading system. So probably sooner or later, we need to discuss how to shape the new model for probably the medical trade agreement, in some sense. In any case, well, we had a lot of interesting insights and the proposal here. The Mr. Wolff or the Professor Elms, do you have any the points to follow up? You want to clarify or you want to respond from the comments by the Ms. Cutler, or anything to add from your previous presentation?
Sorry. You were just talking about exceptions and export restrictions, and it reminded me that early on in the TPP negotiations, we had a side conference of especially law professors, which should be near to your heart, to think about what are the elements that should be in there. And one of the issues that was raised by a colleague of mine out of Hong Kong, Chin-Ling Lim, was about how the TPP should think about having an export controls or an export restrictions chapter in the TPP. And they spent quite a bit of time having this discussion about the fact that the WTO rules on exports were thin, and that in order to think about the future, you should, at the minimum, start adding in export rules, specifically a chapter on export rules, into FTA starting at this TPP level. That didn't happen, clearly. The conversation didn't get very far, and obviously it didn't get picked up in the agreement itself. But I think it's interesting because at the time, people said, what would you need them for? Why would anyone restrict exports? And then you jump forward, and here we are, and you suddenly think, wow, Chin-Ling was onto something. We should maybe have thought a little bit harder at the time about why this might be necessary and what kinds of rules you might need. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that a agreement, as mentioned earlier, would necessarily restrain the actions of members. If they are interested in violating an agreement, they'll violate an agreement, but at least it would have been an interesting way to have a conversation started ahead of a crisis. Because while you can seize an opportunity, sometimes the decision-making in a crisis is not as good as you would like it to be. So maybe some early thinking about that would be good. And this is a nice opportunity for me, before I forget as well, I see people, university students and so forth, and I'm sure that An has colleagues, to say that UNSGAP is launching this policy hackathon on precisely this point. What should FTA rules be in dealing with pandemics? So on things like goods, on services, on investment restrictions, on IP rules, on export restraints or restrictions. So there's a whole, come up with something, figure out what you think model provision should be, submit it to UN SGAP. It should be an interesting project. It just got started. And so there's a month of people getting teams and groups together to put in suggestions, and then we will have that out. So those of you who are interested in this kind of thing, please participate in that. And maybe some of it gets picked up and brought back in to a WTO agreement.
If I may follow on that statement, which is one of the things I was going to say, is that regional agreements are a great place as laboratories for figuring out what would be good on a multilateral basis as well. Fewer countries involved. They are to some degree like-minded in that they live pretty close to each other to some degree if it's a regional agreement. And I don't see regional agreements and the WTO are not in conflict. I see a lot of complementarity. I always had some questions about long-distance bilaterals, which may not have the quality that is needed, and very often they're motivated by a desire to get better treatment than others get, and not much more than that. So on the medical equipment area, and export controls, the WTO took a great deal of pride, its members did too, on the policy space that was granted to members. Sovereignty was a big issue on having a multilateral trading system at all. And the idea was, well, you're free to have environmental controls, you're free to have export controls if there's short supply. And now we've discovered that, well, that's not perfection. In agriculture, as I mentioned, in the agriculture agreement, there is at least a requirement to take into account the effects on others of what you're doing. And in fact, what's very interesting is in the 17 countries applying export restrictions on food, half of those have been removed already. They didn't make a lot of sense. Food is not in short supply globally. Crops are better than they have been in years. Stocks are better than they were certainly during the financial crisis. There are specific problems with areas and commodities in particular places, but there's no run-up of prices. In fact, there's a decline of prices is one of the problems. So that's one thing I would say. The Titanic analogy bothers me because I'm on the ship. And I might say that we are on a ship, but it is more one, it's not going down. It is one that is, it has 164 members who each have an equal voice, and they have difficulty plotting a course, which is not unusual. And there is a need for leadership. And I might say that it has been coming from middle-sized countries. It's been coming from all of the initiatives in the last 2 months have come from middle-sized countries. That comes from Korea, it comes from Singapore, it comes from New Zealand, comes from, and in the WTO, the e-commerce negotiations are from Asia, from Australia, from Japan, and from Singapore. They started, and the big countries, EU, US, China, joined in, but they didn't start it. So there's a major role for middle-sized countries. The raised industrial subsidies. It's true of agricultural support as well, that it has to be multilateral, not regional, not bilateral. In other words, it's very difficult on a regional basis to say, we're all going to restrict our industrial subsidies, but the rest of the world can go ahead totally in freedom and have as much subsidization as they want. You really have to have a global initiative. The same may be true of fishery subsidies, where it would be very difficult to reach an agreement without the major subsidizers involved, and they're not all in the same region. So On the dispute settlement understanding, it is not functioning the way it was intended. There are ad hoc arrangements coming into place, but it still functions. And it's being sorted out in a pragmatic way. 20 countries have opted for one particular solution for it. Others will come up with their own approaches. Is it perfect? No, it's not at all perfect. But it is, our major problem is, in the WTO, in my view, is the ability to make agreements, not the question of dispute settlement, which will, I think, be sorted out ultimately. We have to be able to come together with a consensus. And no country wants to give up the consensus rule. None. No one's suggesting that. What has taken place, though, instead, is the plurilaterals with joint initiatives, coalitions of the like-minded. An said, crisis has ended up in a good place on many occasions, and that's something that I've emphasized in the past. It's not that it's, we are where we are. We have a crisis, and we have more than one crisis. It's not just COVID. It is the multilateral trading system is not functioning the way it should, and there isn't the cooperation that there should be. In the past, that has led ultimately to an effort to make things better, and it has always succeeded in the last 70 years. I have hopes that we'll get there again. I don't think that's a total lack of realism. I think that we have some very talented trade ministers. There are a lot of talented individuals who have been mentioned as a new Director General, and we'll go forward with the support of, to a large extent, the middle-sized countries. And they will have to bring along the some of the majors, I'm afraid, because they aren't currently exercising what would normally be expected of them. So stay tuned. I think we have some real prospects for coming out of this crisis in a better place than we were.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, in Seoul, we have many participants representing the industry sector and also the government sector. Let me check whether we have some questions from the floor here. Do we have any questions? If anybody has a question, you can identify yourself briefly and then you can raise your question. Anybody?
Thank you for sharing your precious time and insight. I am Song Kim from Samuchang, private lawyer and trade. I've been private enterprises navigating turbulence. And I have some big question for this area. How to preserve and promote supporting voice in domestic political landscape, support for open and liberalized trade regime in this pandemic. As a private sector lawyer, I can feel the direct impact from the private enterprises headwinds in this area. So, and I can feel the protectionism on the rise in many aspects. So, I feel the importance of preserving the supporting voice for trade policy and open economy, especially in the pandemic.
Okay, while you are thinking about the response, let me check, do we have any other?
Hello, my name is Jaewon Shin. and I'm a Deputy Director at the Americas Division at the Ministry of Trade. Since I cover the US, I thought I would head my question to Vice President Wendy Cutler, but now, for the right now, time being, I would like to, my question is towards Executive Director Deborah Elms. And you made using the analogy of the sinking boat and the lifeboat, you highlighted how RCEP could be utilized as a minimal platform in the time of risk of multilateralism. And as an alternative to a perfect multilateral WTO, which we may achieve through our minister's 3R initiative. But for the meantime, I agree how regional plurilateralism might help us mitigate some kind of risk towards multilateralism. But based on this, my question is, but in the end, if we could use that plurilateralism, such as RCEP, to kind of bring countries back to the multilateralism of WTO, and it kind of relates to the old debate of whether FTAs are building blocks of the WTO. But my question is, how could the countries utilize the RCEP to restore multilateralism at the WTO?
Okay, thank you. Probably I can accommodate just one more question. Is that no? So you do you have any?
No, I just want to introduce Chief Negotiator of ICEP, Deputy President is here. So, well, I forgot your name. Sorry. No, I mean I forgot the name from the U.S. division, and he asked about ICEP's role in supporting multilateral trade. Or actually, but you also have a very true expert on that area as well as a Korea's chief negotiator for ICEP. So I'm not sure whether he might also want to add his views.
Okay. Thank you very much, Minister Yu, and thanks for very enlightening comments from distinguished guests, the panelists. I think Minister Yu has been engaged in RCEP for a long time, and for the last 1 year, I have been engaged in this RCEP negotiation. And I think despite ups and downs of this RCEP for the last 7 years, I think finally we seem to be seeing kind of slim light at the end of the tunnel. And I think we are cruising towards the signing of RCEP this November, whether with or without India. But I think the COVID-19 made all these 15 countries more desperate to have this RCEP to be signed, because we think that it could send a very strong signal to the rest of the world that this multilateralism in Asia is still alive, and then actually RCEP could play a very important role in reviving this, the trade investment suffering after the COVID-19. So I think in June, Korea is planned to host the ministerial meeting in RCEP, and actually, as some of you mentioned, you emphasize the importance of mid-sized the country, and I think Korea is exactly in the category in this process of RCEP, because Korea has been playing as sort of a coordinator as these countries, which is not ASEAN countries in RCEP. So the question I'd like to pose to this panelist is that you emphasize the importance of middle-sized, the role of middle-sized countries. And I think, that is very important. Of course, we want this WTO to be fully functioning, but if it's not, then also we see this the increasing tension between U.S. and China, and we hope this to be settled down sooner than later. But if it's not, then somebody has to play a leadership role. And I think that, as Wendy mentioned, I think recently these five countries, including Korea and New Zealand and Australia and others, they took a leadership role to develop the rules on the flow of personnel and the goods and so on. So I'm very interested to hear more of your suggestions or idea on how these middle-sized countries could play a meaningful leadership role in this time of this post-COVID-19 area, whether it could be helping this addressing the challenges relate to this global value chain, or there could be the flow of this personnel during this emergency crisis, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now then, let's hear first from the Ms. Cutler, and then I'll go with Mr. Wolff, and then lastly the Debbie. So please.
Well, these are great questions. I'll do my best to briefly address them. First, with respect to growing protectionism, let's just be honest, protectionism was growing before COVID, and now with COVID, where countries like the United States are seeing an over-reliance on imports, particularly from China, of medical equipment, I think that's kind of stoking the fire on protectionism. But also, as someone who's worked in the trade area for many, many years, in a recession, and particularly the recession like we're headed towards, which is going to be global and deep, and may go on for longer than previous recessions, unemployment rises, protectionism rises. And so I think it's going to be extremely important for those countries like Korea and other medium-sized countries in particular that support open markets for goods, services, and movement of people, that they continue these initiatives and try bringing on more and more countries. I think it would also be helpful, and I'll just address the third question before I get to the second one. I think it's important that the medium-sized countries not just that they move from principles to kind of concrete actions that they're willing to take and lead by example. And I know that's difficult because in some of these areas you need the open borders from other countries. But I think moving off principles, we're seeing so many statements that are just repeating the same principles. I think it's important to kind of, just get into more details and into more concrete action. With respect to trade in the United States, I just want to conclude by drawing people's attention to the USMCA, the new NAFTA. That will come into effect July 1. And one of the reasons I want to raise it is that agreement got probably, in recent years and maybe forever, for all years, really attracted the most congressional support of any agreement, and any agreement in my lifetime. And I'm already hearing people in the United States, particularly in Capitol Hill, saying this is going to be kind of the new paradigm for US trade policy, that this agreement is going to be our model going forward. Now, I know that in some countries, the reaction is, oh no, and all they do is think about the auto rules of origin, and maybe some of the labor enforcement provisions, which are extremely important. But what I would argue, if you look at the entire agreement, in many areas, it's lifted from the TPP, or it's even TPP plus, like in the digital area. So I caution our trading partners not to overreact when they hear this. But one of the reasons I wanted to raise the USMCA is that I think it does show that there is support for trade in the United States. And if there wasn't support, this agreement would not have attracted such a huge margin of congressional votes. And so that's just something to think about. I would urge my Korean friends to look at that agreement closely. And again, not just look at the auto provisions, but look at the agreement in entirety. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wolff?
The yeah, okay, thank you. Comments. One is, I go back to the fact that good response. And the most protectionism of the United States ever was in 1930. That was a peak. And in 1934, the Roosevelt administration began trade negotiations, bilateral agreements, and they were all most favored nation. They were all non-discriminatory, even though they were bilateral, which is amazing. But they began the unwinding of protection. So that there's no reason that cannot happen again. The US and China, unsettling to world trade, to be clear. Is the WTO irrelevant to that? It has been done outside the WTO, but there's a possibility of involving the WTO in two ways. If the two, including actually the EU and Japan and others, came to an agreement outside the WTO that should be a broader application, say on industrial subsidies or any of the other subjects being discussed, that should be a broader application, can be brought into the WTO and made a rule of general application. Or there can be a negotiation in the WTO that makes some sense in that context. It won't solve all the problems. The US and Japan had, and they were allies politically, geopolitically, but they had a very difficult ride as Japan increased its growth. And that was managed. There has to be management with respect to the U.S.-China relationship. Wendy mentioned USMCA, and the important thing from a U.S. point of view and from a world point of view is that the administration forged a new coalition in favor of a trade agreement. I think I just want to underline what Wendy said. This was a very strong vote in favor of an open border to the north of our U.S. country and to the south. So the U.S. is not well understood in what it does actually in the WTO. It is not where it was. It does not lead in the same way, but it has tabled a number of proposals, for example, on transparency, that have not immediately been embraced by any means by the membership, but they're not outside the bounds of what can be considered constructive in terms of that, yes, there should be transparency. Countries should live up to their obligations for notifying. And there have been a number of other proposals, many of them controversial, but as Wendy mentioned, one on trilateral with the US, or the EU and Japan on industrial subsidies that deserves consideration. So the US is in a different place. So the middle-sized countries have begun to step forward. It's 3 years into the Trump administration, which did not embrace federalism. And it didn't happen overnight, but nothing does, actually. Nothing good, perhaps, does. That is all that substantive. But the fact is, the middle-sized countries have arrived at a position of crafting responses. On the pandemic, they've been very active. And the Canadian proposal on agriculture, which is 49 countries have joined, is very interesting and promising. So I see just one note to finish on, and that is the WTO is its members. There is no such thing very much in any great text called the WTO that stands aside from its members. It is the members. It is what they make of it. It is a forum for them to move forward. And what we're seeing is leadership from, which is very welcome, from the middle-sized countries now. And I think that you're going to see an improvement, but it'll be slow and it'll be painful. So I don't, I hear what Deborah has said about the difficulties of that are being encountered in the WTO. They're great, but they can be overcome. And I think over time they will be, because in fact, if you look at the values that are incorporated in the multilateral trading system, they make sense. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Debbie? Yeah.
Sure. I mean, clearly, you know, the WTO system is important, and it's obviously important it's all important for all of us. It's important because there are some global issues. We haven't talked climate change, but you know, that's a global issue, requires a global response. Subsidies require global response. Developing countries need, I would argue, especially LDCs and those who are not going to be a natural dance partner in the FTA dance. They need the WTO. So, you know, it'd be great if it was functioning. And again, you know, whatever I can do to help that, fantastic, delighted to do so. But in the interim, I am less confident that they will get their act together in any time frame that certainly a business would imagine. You know, just tell a business that you're not going to get an outcome until 2028 just makes them cry. I mean, we're really losing businesses by the day, actually, in COVID. And so to say it's going to be forever is not very heartening for business. So into that, to me, comes the RCEP experience. Now, RCEP itself is not fabulous. It is not the gold standard of agreements, but it has a few things that I think are important. One is that it shows the difficulties of what we used to call multilateralizing pluralism, which is you start with something small and then you make it bigger, you add more people. And RCEP itself is exactly that, right? It started with 5 separate agreements. The idea was we put them all on the table, we roll them up, RCEP. This is going to be easy. We'll be done in a year, piece of cake. No, turns out very difficult to do, because even among countries that have similar kinds of commitments with each other, trying to knit that all together into a coherent whole is difficult. You can start with plurilaterals in the WTO. You can start with coalitions of the willing. You can start with different ideas and gradually, you know, add and expand. And that's fantastic. It's very useful. It can get done, but it's also difficult. So I think we should be realistic and realize that no matter how you do this, once you start adding together different countries with different interests and different orientations, it's just hard. You know, some I think are easier than others, but in general, it's challenging. So RCEP is an example of why you should be cautious when people say, we can build something awesome off the backs of these smaller initiatives because they will expand and it will be fantastic. Maybe, and again, I'm optimistic, let's hope so. In the meantime, what does RCEP do? Because it's not a fabulous agreement. We're going to have all sorts of challenges. I'm waiting for the biscuit company to come ask me about how to do biscuits in RCEP, and I will have to say, so sorry, I'm sure, with all due respect to the negotiators in the room. Agriculture probably not included very well in RCEP, if at all. So there are going to be holes and gaps in the RCEP agreement. But what does it do? It does a couple of things. One crucial thing is it requires 15 countries to get together all the time in different areas, in goods, in services, in agriculture, in investment, in government procurement, in small businesses. They have to have ongoing discussions. And once you develop that potential platform, again, it wasn't designed for this, but you're going to start having conversations about how do we get out of here? How do we manage to integrate Asia for Asia? And then what are the rules that we think could be spread outwards? How can we get others to join, if not the whole agreement, pieces of the agreement? And so I think you develop a sort of interesting platform that might be successful in getting more trade momentum in a very trade dependent part of the world. So I think that's, for me, partly why RCEP matters. The agreement is nice. It's nice to have, you know, Asia trade for Asia, yay. but it's that ability of a conversation to continue, which I hope that gets seized, of course, by officials going forward, where you can build the momentum. Because one of the challenges, I think, in Geneva, you sit down 164 countries, you all say hello, 3 days go by. This is very difficult to get anything productive. So if you have smaller groups, in this case, like an RCEP, building up the momentum, I think that's helpful. So that's a big part of why I think RCEP is useful as that conversation platform. You know, it's not the only one. CPTPP, which while I've got the last few seconds of this thing, I will say Korea should be in. You should be in CPTPP. You need it. CPTPP needs it. Make it so. Is a sort of different agreement, but it also has that ability to integrate people. There are other kinds of commitments, and I would highlight, which I don't think they've been raised yet, the digital economy agreements that we have coming in Asia. So the DEA and the DEPA, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, signing these agreements with one another, I think also very important. Korea should join on to those as well, while I'm also happy. I think those are important because they do start to set these modules, these ideas to start build that community around key parts of the economy that eventually maybe get ported into the WTO. Maybe they don't, hard to say. It's a little unclear where we go from here, but at the minimum, they're helping keep trade lanes open in Asia. And for a very trade dependent part of the world, it matters. And so if we are not champions of trade in Asia, then no one else is as enthusiastic about it as Asia is. So whatever we can do, whatever Korea can do to make that happen, I think is super important. So let me just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I think for the sake of time, we have to conclude this webinar. Before we conclude, do you have any final remarks?
Well, I just want to say thank you very much for sharing your helpful insights and suggestions and constructive ideas, how to come out of this crisis stronger than before. So Debbie just mentioned, compared this current situation to Titanic hitting the iceberg and then COVID-19 as well. But also I took note that Mr. Wolff mentioned that we are basically the crew of the 164 members of the WTO, a crew of the Titanic or crew of the ship. So well, we can perhaps find some lifeboat down the road, but that lifeboat also should help the ship itself cruise smoothly toward better destinations. So I would say that Korea as one will work together with other WTO members and also trade experts around the world and the WTO Secretariat to help us navigate in this very difficult, challenging time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This event will be uploaded to the KITA homepage, so you can share with your colleague about this webinar. I believe many people will learn from your insight about how to endeavor for our better future. Thank you very, very much for your valuable comments and insight and your wisdom. I also thank the KITA for preparing this event very smoothly, technically. So again, particularly thanks for the Wendy very early in the morning, and then Mr. Wolff for your valuable insight, and then Debbie again, you inspired our government a lot. I do thank you for your excellent comments. Thank you very, very much. I hope that we can continue this endeavor in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.